Hello again and welcome to St. Paul's Lutheran Church here in Alamance County, North Carolina. For this, the second video in celebration of our 250th anniversary here at St. Paul's. In this video, we have the sermon that was presented in our worship today by North Carolina Synod Bishop Timothy Smith.
251 years, except this is 250, right? We're kind of pretending. We're rolling it back. We've been doing a lot of that. It's a joy to be with you all again. I think I was here 4.5 years ago, 5 years ago, close to that. Actually it would be 5.5 years ago. I think it was May of 2016 is what it was. So it is good to be back. But I was supposed to be here last year. And to add insult to injury, not only did we not get to worship together, but we didn't get to eat. And we're not going to get to eat today, and that's my fault, at least in part, because the Synod guideline says that indoors we're supposed to wear a mask unless we're preaching, and then as soon as we're done preaching, put it back on. And though that would preclude sitting down at a table together, because I haven't yet mastered eating with my mask on. Have you? I guess you can do that, but it's not quite the way that we want it to be. But I just want to say, can we just pause a moment? You all have already done it, but can I do that with you in behalf of your sister congregations across the North Carolina Synod and throughout the ELCA and all of our predecessor bodies, and even for the saints yet to come, maybe haven't been born yet. Think of the amazing impact of this place over 250 years. The North Carolina Synod was formed, 1803. You all had already been around for 33 years before that. So I'm not the North Carolina Synod who formed you. You're the North Carolina Synod who formed me. Y'all are the ones, along with some others, who came together and said, there are some things in our Lutheran heritage that we could do maybe better together. And you know what some of those look like that have evolved over the years. Things like a call process. And blessedly, you haven't had to do that for a while since Pastor Nathan's been here. But that's something that we can do, preparing folks for the ministry in general. Synods initially formed because we needed pastors, especially back then, pastors who didn't just speak German, somebody who could be educated in this country and who could afford to do that rather than taking a boat across the big pond. So Southern Seminary was the second Lutheran seminary in the country that synods put together. Lenore University, you ever heard of that, Pastor Nathan? Yeah. You've heard of it. That was done, synodically, because congregations can't form a university for the most part. And Lutherage and Lutherock and Agape and Curie Beach and ministries like that, or Lutheran Services Carolinas with refugee resettlement of Afghans and others, as well as so many. I think they're working on the 12th sort of continuum of care facility for older adults, and then group homes for folks with traumatic brain injuries, and on and on and on. There are just so many things, and I'm leaving things out even now. Women's organizations, men's organizations, youth organizations, that together we're stronger. But there's no point. A synod has no life. A synod doesn't exist for itself. It's an institution. It only exists insofar as that it helps congregations to be more vital and have a larger reach of ministry, and helps our rostered ministers, our deacons, and our pastors be as healthy and whole as they can possibly be. Also their families, and we've certainly seen that during this pandemic. But thank you through the years for all the things that this congregation has done and witnessed and gone through, and the lean years and the difficult years. And if you live that long, you're going to have some conflicts, just like families do, and you're going to have some wonderful times and some building projects and some figuring out how in the world are we going to make it. It's going to be the whole gamut. But God's presence, the gospel, has been the center of this community and continues to be. And that is what has seen us through these many, many, many years. And that's what will see us into the future, is it not? I mean, if not, if we're about something else, if we're hanging on to something else, we might as well, go home or do something different. But we're about the gospel, and the gospel is about us and God's claim on our lives in baptism. Yeah, we had plans for 2020, didn't we? I'm dialing it back. I'm dialing it back to about 18, 19 months ago. I started 2020, blessedly, with a little bit of a mini sabbatical. I went to a little old renovated Airstream camper for a whole week up on top of a mountain outside of Candler, North Carolina, in the mountains. All by myself. No grandbabies. My spouse didn't go. It snowed the whole week. Deer would come up and kind of put their nose on the window and look at me. In fact, a bear even came up and put its nose on the window and looked at me. My purpose in doing that was to discern what God was calling me to do, particularly with regard to maybe going back and serving a parish again, or at least being available potentially for another term as serving as bishop, kind of in that institutional way in the life of the church. I had plans, and I made the plans based on a whole bunch of assumptions that haven't been at all the way it turned out to look. Are you with me? You had plans too, didn't you? Anybody have a wedding in your family somewhere along the line that got messed up? Anybody have anybody in your family or a neighbor or a loved one who got sick or maybe died? Or maybe some of you, maybe right here in this congregation, I don't know, with that blasted pandemic. Any of you have any funerals for a dear one that you planned to have a big celebration, but you couldn't do it like you planned? We had 8 pastors in the last 18 months who died, most of them with COVID-related illness, and we couldn't do what we planned to do. We had a small graveside service, and some of them now we're getting back together and having a bigger memorial celebration. Vacations and events and all kinds of things. You know, you don't need me to tell you. They haven't happened like we wanted them to happen, to say the least. And remember March of 2020? Does anybody remember that? It seems like about 30 years ago. You remember thinking, my gracious, aren't they being a little jumping to conclusions here and getting a little strict here? My gracious, this could last for 6 weeks. 6 weeks, he says, 18 and a half months later. March 2020 took us down an unknown road, one that we just assumed was a quick detour. But while it hasn't been 40 years in the wilderness, it's been a wilderness, all right, hasn't it? I mean, we don't know, is there really a promised land? And if there is, am I going to get to see it? Meaning the other side of this pandemic and some kind of a new normal. I mean, keep thinking about these last 18 months. I mean, throw in, you ever seen a presidential or a congressional election like the one we had last year? I mean, I've never seen anything quite like that. I mean, we've always had 2 or 3 political parties, but and they've always been contentious and sometimes a little sneaky, maybe, and there were always things going on behind the scenes, but my gracious, I've never been in a situation where people just hated each other quite so much and blamed each other quite so much for this or that or the other, regardless of what side you find yourself on. And then throw into that all of the kind of racial tension and so forth, and the debates about these things and about vaccines. And I mean, I've been struggling here, to grasp hold of something familiar or predictable or hopeful. No, you hear my lamentation, right? And I don't suppose in the whole history of the people of God, since the very beginning, even before we read about in the book of Numbers today, I don't think anybody among the people of faith has ever gone through such a hard time as this. Do you? Of course they have. You guys were organized in 1770. What happened 6 years later? A pretty impactful little skirmish, right? A revolutionary war, and then all the things that you just go through your history book and see all of those things in culture have impacted the church, and the church has been the anchor, the place of faith, the place of hope through those difficult times. In fact, when times are going great, people often feel like they don't need the church. I mean, even in some of your lifetimes, there's been a world war. There's been, my grandmother. On the Smith side, was born in 1888. I mean, she saw the invention of automobiles and a couple of world wars and so on and so forth. So we know that people have been through hard times before. I mean, go back and read the 11th chapter of Hebrews if you ever get a chance. That ends with the 12th chapter. Since therefore we're surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, which you all are, the saints who've gone before us, the shoulders on which we stand at St. Paul's here. How have people of faith found a way to cope and to move forward during times like this? How? Well, this book of Numbers, I'm not preaching so much on the gospel today as on this Old Testament lesson because it's just so delicious. If you read about human nature in it, it's called Numbers in English. We call it Numbers. What a boring name for a book of the Bible. But in Hebrew it literally means, the title of the book literally means in the wilderness. How have people of faith coped in the wilderness? So it's not so much about, a destination, which sounds kind of static, but what about this journey that we're on in the meantime before we reach the fullness of the reign of God? Moses and Israel have been dramatically freed. You remember the Sunday school stuff, right? The horse and rider thrown into the sea. The seas open up. Everybody gets through. And that's after all the dramatic plagues that have come. And finally, doesn't want to, but Pharaoh finally lets the people go, then changes his mind, and they chase him. And then the Egyptians get drowned in the sea. And now they're out there in the wilderness. It's exactly what they always wanted. Let my people go. Well, we're free. And then God gives them manna in the wilderness to sustain them, calls Moses up on the mountain, gives them rules, the 10 Commandments about here's the way that it's going to work well together. You didn't have to worry about that before because your slave master was telling you everything you had to do and all the things you couldn't do. But now that you're free, you still have to have some rules. And here are the ways that it's going to work well for you in the land that I'm about to show you. All of these things God has provided exactly like the folks wanted. And so do they praise God? No. They do something that folks here at St. Paul's in Burlington would never dream of doing. They complain. And I know that's never happened here, right, Pastor Nathan? They complain. In fact, they form a committee, which is what people of faith always do. They form what has become and still is and maybe ever shall be the most powerful committee ever in the life of the church, though you will find it listed in no annual report. It usually meets in the parking lot after worship. It's called the Back to Egypt Committee. You have one. Oh, we have it at the Synod office. Every congregation I've ever served or seen has a Back to Egypt Committee, and it is powerful, let me tell you. I have the Back to Egypt Committee in me. And you have it in you. This isn't fun. It was better the old way. Too much uncertainty. Let's go back. That's the Back to Egypt Committee. I discovered the Back to Egypt Committee's strength my very first week in my very first parish in Startown. You know where Startown is outside of Hickory? It really is just a little bedroom community of Hickory. An usher brought me a note, my first Sunday right out of seminary. And I got a bunch of notes. People were handing me all kinds of notes. I didn't even know what I was supposed to do with them, but apparently they were announcements. And I was supposed to get up and read through the notes. Some of them I couldn't even read the handwriting. But I got to this one that the usher gave me that seemed rather frantic, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I looked at it and I thought, am I supposed to read this out loud? But what it said was, and I read it, Pastor, there's no toilet paper in the women's room. You know, this is what you call a dilemma. They did not prepare me for that in seminary. I mean, I learned to read a little bit of Hebrew. That's hard. And a little bit of Greek, and to do systematic theology. And I took preaching courses and worship leading courses and history courses and all of these wonderful things to teach the Bible. But they didn't tell me about the toilet paper in the women's room. Well, I come to find out, having really stressed about it the whole time, is somebody stranded even as we speak? You know, somebody told me afterwards, look, don't worry about it. We took care of it. But Pastor Bruce always made sure there was toilet paper in the women's room before worship. Note to self. The next day, somebody called me and said, Preacher, the grass is getting mighty tall out there in front of the sanctuary and over there in the cemetery. I'm like, yeah, I noticed that too. And they're like, well, Pastor Bruce used to always mow the grass in front of the cemetery and in front of the sanctuary and everything else. And okay, note to self. And that's how it went for the first 2 weeks. Well, Pastor Bruce used to. You know what I did? I mean, I was a young whippersnapper pastor. Now I'm an old whippersnapper pastor. But what I did, and I honestly did, I called Jimmy Bruce because he had moved to Laurinburg. He was my predecessor. And I said, Tim here, I promise I won't bother you in Startown, but I got a few questions for you. Would you be willing to come back and mow the cemetery and the grass in front of the sanctuary? And he said, are you kidding me? I said, no, I just need to know. He said, no. I said, well, would you at least come back and make sure there's toilet paper in the women's room and so on? And I went down the list and he said, no, what are you doing? And I said, no, you've given me what I needed. Got to the council meeting because I was just waiting because I knew it was going to come up. And guess what? Sure enough, the Back to Egypt committee had been meeting in the parking lot. And somebody finally said, well, preacher, Pastor Bruce used to always, I said, what? I hate to interrupt you, pardon me for being rude, but let me tell you, just so you won't have to waste all of your time anymore, I called Pastor Bruce the other day, and he's not willing to do that anymore. And they looked at me like, this man is crazy. And I am. Like the Hebrews in Egypt. We implore God to do a new thing. Now, we pray for the Holy Spirit, like in a call process, or this or that or the other. And God does a new thing, and guess what? We don't like it all the time. Because it's going to make us uncomfortable or different, and we're called upon to change things every single day. Like, you know, do we get a vaccine? Do we not get a vaccine? Do we do this? Do we do that? We complain. We murmur. And I love history. I'm a history buff. I'm really a traditionalist in a lot of ways. Don't move my Christmas tree from where it always goes. That's the Christmas tree. I'm talking like 8 inches. Don't move it. It goes on this little spot here. Here's the way that we do it. These are the songs that I like. And so on and so forth. But we do it, don't we? I mean, think of how absurd this passage is, because you know where those Israelites had been for all of that time. They were slaves. They were beaten and killed and separated from their families and all of this horrendous stuff. And what do they have the gall to do to Moses? Don't you feel sorry for Moses? We want to go back. It wasn't so bad there. The food was definitely better. The garlic, the onions, and everything else. Oh, it's just making my mouth watering out here. You're giving this old nasty communion wafer manna stuff, that tastes terrible. And then, okay, so some quail. Fine, but I'm tired of quail. I want something else. I mean, the lashings there, when you think about it, they weren't all that bad. We really didn't have to decide anything because somebody else decided everything for us. I want it back like it was. Whenever I go visit congregations, especially smaller congregations, and we have a ton of those, and they're getting smaller, many of them, almost always, and understandably, they want the same thing that I would want if I were them. They want to go back to like it was, when we had a big Luther League, and when we had this, and when we had that, and when we had lots more people, and we had leadership, and everybody in the community seemed to pull together, and we were the church. I get that. In 1998, I want you to remember, I'm not talking about this year or 2 years ago because you'll think I'm talking about something else. In 1998, Lutheran church historian Martin Marty wrote about how fickle our memory is and wanting to dial it back to how it used to be. Like the Israelites, we idealize, we even idolize the past sometimes. At least the privileged among us do. Let's go back to the way it used to be. When it was the golden age of the church, and by that most people mean the 1950s or the early 60s. And I was born during that time period because that seemed to be when everything looked successful and the sky was the limit. That's just the way it is really everybody. Oh, things were great back then in the 50s, weren't they? In the life of the church. Martin Marty says, great for whom in the 1950s? Or as Pastor Cece, who is an African-American pastor on our staff who lives over here in Greensboro, said to a congregation not so long ago when they said, Pastor Cece, we just need to get back to when it was wonderful again, like the 1950s. And with all sincerity and without any harshness, she said, that wasn't so wonderful for my people. The 1950s. Women, blacks, Hispanic, uninsured. When were those times, Martin Marty asks? In 1998. Was it the late 1700s that were such great times? Or the early 1800s? I mean, you all did an amazing thing to form a congregation in 1770. Because during that time, fewer than 10% of all people in what we now call America were affiliated with any church whatsoever. That was not the golden age of the church. You all were like me, a bunch of stubborn Lutherans who decided that we're German and we're going to do this and we're going to get with the Reforms because they speak German too and we're going to have a church. And it was a wonderful thing, but it wasn't culturally in sync. Y'all were countercultural when you did that. Do you know that? It was a weird and hard time for the church. Abuse was rampant, not to mention the reality of slavery. You know what standard birth control was in the early 1800s? I mean, by the tens of thousands. Birth control meant hiding the pregnancy and having the baby in secret and disposing of the child after it was born. Happened all the time, well documented. In fact, there are even remains. The Civil War was horrendous. The 1920s were a financial and a moral disaster. And my grandmother that I mentioned a while ago, born in 1888, she couldn't even legally vote until she was 32 years old. Why? Anybody want to guess? She was a woman. And when she could vote in 1920 and lived in Hudson, North Carolina, and had to go to Lenore to vote, neither her daddy nor any of her brothers would drive her to vote because they didn't think she should. Is that what we want to dial it back to? Women, are you with me? Let's just cut you out of the equation and get back to pure patriarchy. You get my point. I mean, certainly there were wonderful times. When my other grandmother was born in 1903, and I have her old family Bible, and I look back at it, and I see all of her siblings, and I'm asking my mom, several years ago before Mom died, I never heard of these triplets. I never heard of Uncle Malcolm. I never heard of any of these people. And she's like, oh, well, it's because they all died before they got to be 5 years old. Did you know about 60% of all children in 1903 died before they reached age 5? Is that what we want to roll it back to? Is that what the Back to Egypt Committee forgot when they were looking at how wonderful it used to be? Yes, we glean the wonderful pieces, and we should and celebrate those pieces of the past. But it's not always as bright as we remember. Memory and heritage have such a strong place. But I think the point of the passage in this Numbers thing today is that they can also become idolatry. When we're more comfortable with familiar pain and slavery than we are with the unknown of the future in which God in Christ, who is risen from the dead, already resides. The transformational power of God. We give thanks for our past and for those saints who struggled through things we can't even begin to imagine. You know that? They really did. But we can't go back. As much as if we even truly want to, we can't go back. A change is hard. I don't like change, and certainly not just for the sake of change, but it's inherent in the transformational power of God, that God is going to be calling me and forming me to be something that I wasn't, and something that I maybe am yet to be. And after watching and observing as a church member and as a pastor, and 6 years now as a bishop, I'm afraid I'm going to have to tell you that I've come up with only one admittedly drastic solution to the destructive negativity of the Back to Egypt Committee. But there is a way to thwart their purpose. Are you listening? Because here it is. We have to kill them. No, I'm serious. I know it sounds drastic. We got to kill the Back to Egypt Committee. In fact, I think God already knew that. And when God called on us to be baptized and to drown the old self in our baptism, that old self included the Back to Egypt Committee that was always wanting to go back to the way it was and to the familiar, to the static, to some frozen moment in time that we remember way better than it actually was. Kill the old sinful self in me daily, as I remember the promise of my baptism, and in you, as God says, you can celebrate history and history and history and history, and you need to, because you got a marvelous one here, and we're here to do that even today. But God's also calling you right now to say, what does it mean for St. Paul's in Burlington, standing on the shoulders of these ones who've gone before us and endured and went through and passed on the faith through all of these things. Now, what is God calling us to pass on in the decisions that we make for the future? So many congregations I visit demand to go back. Just like Moses, folks. But only with eyes forward do we move into the future. Do we ever reach the promised land? Removing not only us from the Egypt that's ingrained in us, but also from the bondage in Egypt itself. By the God who calls us from a future beyond death itself. That promise is the only one like it. Everybody else's promise, at the very least, is going to be conditional on their living, and they're going to die. But we follow the one whose promise is beyond death itself. I want to close by quoting Bishop Michael Curry. You know who Michael Curry is? Used to be Episcopal Bishop of the Diocese of North Carolina. So, not too terribly far from here, headquartered, and he still lives in Raleigh. If you don't know him in that context, if you watch the most recent royal wedding, he asked for a church that's no longer centered on empire or establishment, no longer fixated on the preservation of institutions, no longer propping up white supremacy or in collusion with anything that hurts or harms any child of God or God's creation. It's a vision for the future. And admittedly, from an Episcopalian, an African-American, North Carolinian Episcopalian. Are such visions possible? They are if God is alive and up to something. Like St. Paul's in Burlington. Not only making it, but making a difference for the sake of the gospel, not only in what you see right now, but in all the ways you've paid the gospel forward to other communities. Some of the ones that you might lament who aren't here anymore, they're somewhere else, making a difference, if not in the church, in their lives, because of how they have been formed here. And there are others yet to be formed in faith here in this place and sent out. God has called you, St. Paul's, corporately, and each of you individually. Who'd have thunk? I look at me, I'm not going to make a message for you. But if God can call me and use me even in some tiny little way, then God can do anything. Imagine what all else. Amen.